Welcome back, everybody. This is going to be our second portion. I'd like to welcome our guests, Dylan and Wizard from OBS. They are here to help us out talking about all the fun little technical things in OBS. So now's your opportunity. What was that? I'm sorry. All right, so make sure if you have any questions to ask our wonderful OBS representatives that you pop it into our asking questions right there. That way you guys can get all of that out there for us.
It's right if we answer chat directly, because I already see a good question, which would probably be good to preface this with.
Sure, if you want to hit it up, then go for it.
Supernova Stud, we are going to be just doing probably just OBS. However, we're going to try and make it as generic as possible. So like if you are using another streaming service, like even if you're using XSplit, if you're using something more professional like vMix or Wirecast, the principles should still apply. But we aren't going to be doing anything with slobs. No.
Alrighty, so hopefully
just wanted to make sure that was out of the way first.
Sorry.
Oh yeah, a lot of people get confused about the Streamlabs OBS, which is technically a different streaming program, if I'm correct. I would believe so. But yeah, so
the back end code is the same, but there's a whole lot of differences about how you use the program, and there's enough changes to it that they're basically different programs.
Okay.
But there are similarities there.
All right, so our first question that we have is my stream tends to lag really far behind what I'm streaming. How can I adjust my settings on OBS to fix this?
So lag like that is usually caused by your bitrate being too high and OBS not being able to keep up and keep you in line with what you're trying to stream at. So lowering your bitrate and in some cases even lowering your resolution to match should help in that aspect. Most streaming tools will allow you to actually run a tool that can automatically figure out what bitrate you want to run at. Which can give you a good starting point to figure out, okay, where exactly can I fix this? So that's where I would check first, personally.
Yeah, OBS does have its auto configuration wizard. It gives you the option when you first launch, but it's also in tools. Most other programs will have similar tools. Another potential issue which can cause the same kind of delays is if you're encoding on your CPU, so you're using software encoding. If you're taxing your CPU preset set too high, that can also result in lag situations where it starts getting increased delays. You just have to be constantly aware of how your streaming program is doing. I know in OBS's case, we do have a stats window specifically for diagnosing what those issues are. So in view stats, I can actually show it on stream. Actually, quickly pull that up. Yeah, there's a window. If you go to view stats, comes up with a window which will tell you all the different diagnostics. You can figure out exactly why a particular issue is happening.
Okay. So what's a good bit rate to start at when you're streaming? My upload is 25 megabytes.
The first key point to address, as I've mentioned this also in your chat earlier, upload speed is, at least like if you're doing like a speed test, is not going to be a good indication of what you can comfortably stream at, because it's going to a server which is likely a lot closer than the Twitch ones, and it's more about what you can consistently upload rather than raw speed. The auto configuration wizard, again, will try and figure out a bit rate which is good for you. And if I can link in your chat, it's will I be timed out if I link?
Let me give you permits really quick. I apologize about that. Hold on, misspelled that. All right, that should be. There you go.
At least in the case of Twitch, that's also a good starting point because it will try out all the different servers. It will tell you what bitrate you can reasonably expect to stream at that particular server, and it will also give you a quality rating, which is basically just how stable is your connection. Like 100 means you should expect to not experience drop frames at that bitrate, and then if it's lower, that means you might want to consider giving yourself some headroom.
Okay. So I guess the one thing that I would probably ask along lines of that, so would bitrate be something that affects when you have someone who comes into your stream and, you know, you get all this buffering and, you know, it's not consistent and it's not for everybody, but all of a sudden someone's like 5 minutes behind on your stream after watching for an hour. Is that because their internet speed isn't high enough, or is that still affect because you're just streaming at too high of a bitrate and it's too much, or do you think you should be lowering it?
Yes, so every viewer's internet connection on that front can affect their their buffering. If you're partnered, your viewers are able to use the transcoding that's available to watch at a lower quality than what you're streaming at. But if you are often hearing from your viewers that your stream is buffering, then it's probably a good idea to lower some of those settings on your end to better cater to your audience.
So if you're not partnered, go ahead.
Particularly in case, I was just gonna say, like, affiliates, you're more likely to get quality options, but it's still super inconsistent. So when you're starting out, that's a lot more of a concern than if you've become partnered or you've become a lot bigger. You need to be constantly keeping communication with your viewers. Like, is the stream okay? Are you having problems? I can just on my end and try to make things work for you.
Because I've noticed that I run into problems where someone says they can't adjust the video quality, and I'll be streaming at 1080 because I have the computer that I want to. You know what I mean? I want to stream at high quality because I have the computer that backs it. And then all of a sudden someone says, hey, I can't handle it, like it keeps loading or something. So that shouldn't be necessarily the video quality, but just maybe lowering the bitrate should fix that? Or do you think, like, is there a way to kind of balance the two out? Or should you just go and run at a lower video quality?
Quality can affect can affect in certain situations. Like, some people just have computers which don't like 1080 60 at sometimes. But primarily, if it's buffering, most times it is purely just bitrate. And if people want to check that, Twitch has in the advanced video stats, you can see what the variable look at is buffer size, and that will tell you how much is actually already loaded over the stream. And if that's constantly reaching 0, then you know, yes, this is a network issue. And 99 times out of 100, it's a networking issue.
I got you.
I actually had a question, if I could.
Go ahead.
So I am currently, we've talked about it before, debating on getting a second PC because I've tried CPU encoding and I've tried, like, I find that I mainly have to do GPU encoding because I've got a pretty beefy, I've got a 1070 super clock. But so I use my monitor for both console and PC gaming. Well, I can't switch my monitor with my HDMI switcher without it crashing OBS. So when I'm doing that, I either need to stop stream or I have to encode through CPU, so I don't get that problem when I'm doing encoding with the GPU, because the GPU has to reformat and it can't encode when it's doing that. I guess my question is, what is the difference between running X.264 or QuickSync, or the QuickSync, I think is what it's called? Like, what's the difference?
The Intel, QuickSync's the Intel iGPU one. NVIDIA's, AMF's is AMD's.
Okay.
It varies. Is not
Right,
the
right.
is not an easy answer.
Sure.
QuickSync is fairly consistent if you have it available, but it's not a particularly good encoder. But it uses a dedicated part of your CPU. It's all the GPU encoders use dedicated chips or compute engines on the cards or CPU, so that they don't use up any other resources you would expect.
Right.
So NVINC, there's a chip on your GPU which is purely just NVINC, nothing else. It doesn't affect anything else, but you are sacrificing quality there. it seems like your particular issue you mentioned is just a case of the GPU sort of just halting for a second.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So, but it's just because like I've got a 4th gen Intel i7.
Yeah.
So it's not quite as beefy as it was, even 2-3 years ago.
Same.
So I'm actually debating on trying, but my big thing is artifacting when I'm using the Intel QuickSync. So it's just trying to dial everything in, but I just wasn't sure if it would be better to use QuickSync or if I should use the actual X264. I feel like N26 or the X264 is probably going to use more of my actual CPU than it is than if I were to do QuickSync, though. Would that be correct in my thinking?
Yeah. X264 will use more of your CPU because it's actually encoding on the CPU. QuickSync uses a dedicated chip specifically for that.
Okay.
QuickSync is not as bad as AMF. I mean, AMD cards are great, but their AMF encoder is just not good. It's been proved. QuickSync isn't as bad as that, but you're gonna notice artifacting more often than you would with X264.
Okay.
X264 is still just the best encoder available, but you're using your CPU.
Sure.
Which is why people suggest a second computer to do that
Right,
encoding for you.
because you want to be able to dedicate CPU to encoding, and if you're streaming on the same computer, you run into issues there. If you have a 10 series NVIDIA card, you're currently the best off out of most people because NVENC on 10 series cards is roughly similar to X264 at the base settings, and because it's on a dedicated chip, you're not having to deal with it using up CPU. It's on its own thing, and it's roughly the same quality.
Right.
If you're
Absolutely.
on a lower NVIDIA card, so like a 9 series or earlier, you're going to still get a quality hit, but not nearly as bad as QuickSync. But if you want the best, you're just going to it's kind of a situation where the CPU is just the best job.
Well, I mean, that's what it's built for. And then my other question, I guess, if you're going to end up going with NVENC or something like that, or GPU side, there is a setting in OBS that allows you to choose frame something. I can't remember it right now, and I can't open my OBS, otherwise it'll crash my webcam. But if it's like the very bottom setting on OBS when you're in the NVENC settings. And it's like most people suggest 2, but I guess I don't know what that actually means because there's not like a little thing that says this is what this does.
Are you talking about the 2-pass encoding option?
Yes, that's it. Thank you.
So what's the question about it? Like if you should have it on or not?
Like if is 2 the best way to go, or like what kind of quality hit am I taking if I lower it or raise it? Like what does that actually do?
2-pass encode. This is a bit more technical. Sorry.
Sure.
No easy answer here. 2-pass encoding, in theory, should make the quality slightly better. I don't know exactly by how much. I cannot show images saying here's A and B.
Right.
Pick which one you think is best. I couldn't do that. But in theory, it should be slightly better, whether or not it's of value. Changes.
Okay.
But the downside of 2-pass encoding is it uses what are on your this is in the NVIDIA side. It uses what are called CUDA cores on your GPU, and that can cause problems if you're doing specific GPU tasks and other programs. But if you're gaming, it shouldn't be an issue.
Okay.
So in most cases, there's no reason to not have it on.
Okay, perfect.
Well,
Overall, in most cases, especially with in most cases with GPU encoding, you shouldn't need to adjust the settings. But one thing that we are looking into in terms of OBS specifically is we do want to add more kind of hover text and stuff like that that'll explain those kinds of settings to you so that you can make that decision on your own instead of having to look up tutorials and stuff like that.
Absolutely. That's a great idea.
Yeah, because we could say all this, but it's not going to reach everyone who's using OBS.
Right,
and
right.
that sort of thing people need to know. there is only one instance where I know where two-pass encoding is actually a problem, and that's if you're trying to do 4K 60. I know that a few people have tried doing NVENC
Mm.
4K 60, and they run into problems with two-pass encoding. That's the only time I've ever seen it actually cause any tangible issue, though.
Okay. Awesome. Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
All right, so since we were talking about separate streaming computers, there's a plugin for OBS called NDI. Does NDI work better than a capture card if using a separate streaming PC?
So it entirely depends. To use NDI, you need a good network connection between those two computers. We usually recommend hardwire. And it can sometimes be very tricky to push something like 1080p 60 between those computers, even on hardwire, especially with NDI, because it tries to send it at the highest possible quality. With capture cards, you are spending money, and with that, you have a budget, and you might go for a cheaper card that might not support higher quality, or you might get a card that has a longer delay on it. So I personally like to suggest NDI. A lot of people tend to prefer capture cards because you know what you're getting, you plug it in, you select your quality settings, and you're good to go. Sometimes NDI can be a little finicky on that front, and sometimes because you're doing stuff over the network, you can occasionally get it to start to delay over time, which not a lot of people run into, but it's something that you do have to consider on that front.
And you also have to remember that this isn't the purpose that NDI was made for, because NDI is a video standard for taking, it's usually used in regular broadcasts, like if you have cameras which you know are going to be roaming and you need to get that signal wirelessly. That's what the protocol was designed for. People are just repurposing it, and in future there should be better solutions which deal with the latency issues, that deal with being low impact on the network. NDI is still a really great option if you can't afford a capture card, though. And in the meantime, it is still currently the best option out there for that explicit purpose.
Okay. The next question I have here is: I have a pretty healthy stream on PC, but on mobile, other people tend to be really delayed to the point where it's almost unwatchable. Is this an issue with my OBS settings? If so, can you help identify what the issue is?
So as we explained earlier, that kind of thing is usually down to either the user's player not being able to keep up with that bitrate, or the streamer's settings not being able to keep up. If it's specifically mobile users, then it could even be that if they're trying to watch, say, at 1080p 60, even if they're connected to Wi-Fi, the phone itself might be struggling to keep up with that video, depending on what kind of phone it is. Definitely, if possible, they should, as a viewer, lower their settings if possible. But if they can't do that, then they should let the streamer know, so the streamer could, for example, go down to 720p 60, which is usually the average that a lot of smaller streamers use, or 720p at 30 FPS, so that they can reach the widest audience with that low delay.
Okay, cool. So, in general, say I'm streaming for the first time and I just downloaded OBS. What is... Because I remember when I first did it, I went to YouTube and I looked up videos on how to set up your OBS. Now, someone's going to tell you how to set up OBS based on their computer, generally is what happens. They're going to tell you, a couple variations based on, this is one thing that you're going to change that's depending on, like, how good is something, how good is another thing. Like, that's kind of where, like, what is your best recommendation in terms of, like, yes, we talked about bitrate, yes, we talked about, video quality. There's so many settings on OBS to set up your stream. Is there, like, a main method, besides obviously joining your guys' Discord, which has a lot of help, which helped me out a lot? Is there, like, a main reference in terminology? Where do I go to get a general walkthrough? My first time ever downloading OBS before I start up my first stream ever.
So obsproject.com/wiki will give you lots and lots of guides written by the community on how to actually understand a lot of the settings and things like filters and keyboard shortcuts and all of that. That'll overall help you, we do have a quick start guide that is literally 4 steps, which is the auto config tool, setting up audio, video, and then testing and streaming. Those are usually the 4 that you should do. Don't try and learn everything at once because there is a lot to know. But once you feel you're comfortable with the basics, then you can go onto the wiki. You can browse the, I would say, 15 pages that we have there. Some of them are really long with a lot of screenshots to give you those guides to help you understand what you're doing. And YouTube can be very helpful in on that front. There is a YouTube series by a YouTuber called Epos Fox. He calls it the Master Class, and he's done in-depth guides on very specific features like NDI as well, and sometimes more broad on, you know, how can you get the best out of your audio regardless of what hardware you're using or, you know, what kind of setup you have. So using YouTube guides can be helpful, but keep in mind that not every YouTuber knows 100% everything, and they might get things wrong. And some of them will correct themselves in the comments or in the description, but or in a follow-up video. But keeping in mind that there are lots of guides out there. Some of them can be super accurate, and some of them might only get some of it right.
All right, and I'm going to permit you, if possible, for links in chat. If you could post that website that you mentioned in chat, that way maybe we can have that reference, because that sounds really cool. But yeah.
Yeah, the great thing about that wiki also is if you look at some of the troubleshooting guides, they're not necessarily OBS specific. Like the drop frames wiki page just mentions a bunch of steps that you can do to try and diagnose whether or not something how to fix drop frames is like changing server, lowering bit rates, using a wired connection, try another service to test. So like if you're normally streaming to Twitch and you want to know, is this a Twitch issue, you could try streaming to YouTube. All the advice there would still apply if you're using XSplit, if you're using Gamecaster, if you're using Slobs. It's all the same advice, which is a great thing for people who aren't necessarily sold on OBS.
Yeah, because then again, the issue might not always lie in OBS. That's the other thing, I guess, that people don't think about, because there is more than just the streaming software.
Drop frames happen purely based on networking issues. OBS uses Windows or whatever operating system you're on. It uses that operating system's own functions for sending out the video. If there's going to be drop frames, it's going to be a network issue, almost certainly. Like I've personally yet to see a situation where drop frames was like the specific mention of drop frames in OBS was not a networking issue.
I got you.
There's also the weird distinction that we actually distinguish between drop frames, skipped frames, and stalled frames. It's just that's a whole other thing entirely. I think the wiki also mentions the differences between those.
Okay.
The wiki. Sorry.
Oh, no, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say the wiki will explain most of this.
Okay. And then we have one last question before we switch on to our next topic. Does OBS plan on introducing an optimize feature? Or something similar?
So I mean, they did talk about how they have that wizard.
Yeah, so we have the auto config wizard. Yeah, the auto config wizard does what canvas size to use, what bit rate to have, what resolution to stream at and record at, if that's what you're doing. There is at least a couple people working on what we call dynamic bit rate, which if your internet connection, for example, is usually stable but sometimes dips, rather than dropping frames, OBS could instead, which is what XSplit and a lot of other programs do, is just lower your bit rate slightly to match so that you're not dropping frames. Optimizations in terms of other things like CPU and all of that can be very hard to do automatically, and it's something you as a streamer need to monitor yourself. If you're constantly seeing your CPU hitting 100%, you might need to lower some game settings or close some programs. If you're seeing your GPU constantly hitting 100%, which OBS needs a bit of headroom to be able to actually do its own thing, then on that front, lower some game settings, usually turning on VSync or a frame limiter and lowering render distance are the biggest things you can do. But it could even be something as small as, you know, texture quality in a game or whatever. So you as the streamer really have to kind of monitor that kind of thing. Usually once you've kind of come up with settings that you're happy with, as long as you don't change those settings too much in the future, or as long as when you start new games, you lower the settings to match that kind of level, then you shouldn't run into issues. But every streaming application is different on that front, and all of us do have our own support channels where if you feel that something in the program itself is causing issues for you, you can visit those support channels, whether it be on Discord, on Twitter for some providers, to actually ask questions like that in more detail. We'll request a log file that will give us details about your system that we can read and kind of explain why certain things are happening for your specific case.
There is, I just remember, there is a one specific optimization which is actually currently being worked on, which should be still a while, but is an important one. Currently, browser sources in OBS, they use a lot of CPU, and it's because they're running each browser source is running an instance of Chromium or Chrome, the basis of Chrome, and it's not being rendered on the GPU. Getting that working is currently being worked on, and that will mean browser sources in the future should hopefully have very little impact. That's the only specific optimization that is being worked on at the moment, at least.
Yeah.
All right, so right before we wrap up, we did have a question. So you want to start streaming, but you don't have great software. Is there to make it easier on your ping, or is it better to wait until you do have better software? Not sure if she's talking about
So in terms of ping, internet is a very big factor on that front. OBS specifically does have the option in the advanced settings called new network code and low latency mode, specifically for that use case, where you notice that when you're streaming, your games have higher ping. So those are settings you could possibly experiment with. But if you're seeing an impact in your games specifically with ping, then you do need to look into possibly upgrading your internet and possibly even upgrading your computer as well, or your networking gear.
All right. Well, thank you guys so much for joining us. Please, if everyone could do me a favor, please go ahead and follow both of these wonderful people on Twitter and Twitch. Thank you guys so much for being a guest with us. We have another quick little intermission segment before we switch over to our next guest with Stream Elements. All right. Thank you guys so much.